I think we'll just get going. So what I'll talk about is scenario analysis, and really how. So the title of the talk is how maps can change the way we think about the future, but it's really how maps can change scenario analysis. And since it's about the future, I figured I'd jump on the trend and generate an AI generated picture here. So I made this by DALL-E yesterday. I just wrote a scenario analysis in DALL-E, and this is one of the 4 pictures that came out. I thought it was pretty neat. So that's that. All right, so scenario analysis. We have 3 parts to this talk. So first is a short recap in history. We're going to look at how it's done traditionally, and then again look at how maps actually changes how we do it, and really changes how we think about it. So what is it? So traditionally, you think about scenario analysis or as a way of investigating future. So you are somewhere in the present, and then depending on what happens to your life or to the world, different paths can happen. So essentially, you try to use scenario analysis as a sandbox to look at and try to understand the future. And traditionally, a scenario is a story or a story outline, and that's something we can take with us going forward in this talk. So the key message is that the scenario is a collection of stories. You describe the world with stories. And you can imagine that you might want to ask yourself, so why does businesses care about this? Why do they care about stories of the future? And there's a very good reason for it. Scenario planning and scenario analysis is not only confined to business, of course. It's done by governments and municipalities and all kinds of entities. But I'll concern myself mostly with scenario analysis for business here and for business strategy. So the reason for it is really that a practice of scenario analysis developed at Shell, and it has a very long history at Shell. So it actually started sometime in the 1940s. Scenario analysis did with the Rand Corporation in the US. And the Rand Corporation started using scenario analysis to think about nuclear war. So pretty serious considerations. And they developed a number of techniques to do it. And this was picked up by a number of people at Shell that started to use these techniques to try to predict the future and become better at business from that. And they did well enough so that Shell could actually predict the oil crisis in 1972. And their practice of scenario analysis also is credited with Shell avoiding consolidation in the 1980s. And they've continued to do this allegedly, and has a recipe for success around this. And they've used it to really shift from being an oil company or an oil and gas company to becoming an energy company towards where we are now. Now, how true is that they've become an energy company? I don't know, but they've at least given sort of the green transformation a go. So all of these successes, of course, means that others become interested in scenario analysis. And we remember that scenarios, they're stories. So it turns out it pays to be story driven, right? But we have Uncle Simon, and he really says, nope, it doesn't pay to be story driven. That's not how you do it. So, but Shell, how can they be story driven and succeed? So we'll dig into how that can happen. But first, let's have a little look at how you go about creating scenarios for strategy development. So the first thing I should say is that there are a lot of ways of developing scenarios. I will cover 2, but there's probably something like 10 or 20 ways of doing this. And here down in the bottom of the page here, you have a link to a pretty good resource when it comes to scenario analysis that's been released by the government of UK, where you have a list of something like 15 or 20 tools you can use for scenario development. But when you get commercials for future studies and scenario analysis, and so I get this commercial for a place in Copenhagen on my Instagram. They want me to go study there. Most of the time, they talk about a method that you see here, where you use sort of a general look around for macro drivers using Pestle. And Pestle is essentially looking at trends, right? So it's a trend analysis. And Pestle is a short acronym for political, economical, societal, technological, legal, and environmental. There are other sort of versions of this. The shortest one is PEST. There's the Pestle, and then there's the Pestle with the E. There are also extensions where you also... But so the whole thing is that you're going to try and look at all the factors that affects your organization. And that's good. You just look out into the world and you see what trends are affecting you. Okay, so in a way, that's building some sort of sense for what's going on. To do a scenario analysis, you then have to go dig into these trends and this data. So what's traditionally done is that you create a classic 2x2 matrix. So whenever you have these consulting frameworks, you're going to see 2x2 matrices. And you divide these trends up in importance and uncertainty. And then you divide it all up. So you have certain and important trends, you have uncertain but important trends, you have uncertain unimportant trends, and you have certain unimportant trends. And depending on where a trend falls in this matrix, you then take different action. And if it's certain and important, you can just deal with it directly. If it's uncertain and important, that means you should do scenario analysis. Uncertain, unimportant, you have to sort of keep track of it since you don't really know what's going to happen, but you don't think it's going to concern you. And then certain unimportant, you can just put in the shelf and never care about again. What you then do with these uncertain important trends is that you sort of divide them up into extreme points. So we'll do a little bit of an example later so you can see how it actually works. But you take the trends and you find extreme points for them and you stretch them out to extremes. And then you combine them. And then in each of the quadrants that this sort of double uncertainty matrix creates, you have a world where certain extremes have happened. And then you take those worlds. Normally, you can't really observe all of them. You choose a few that you feel are interesting. And then you explore what that world will look like. So that's where you get. And what does the world look like? You can do that either you just write a story about it, or you can use all kinds of tools to try and figure it out, like a business model canvas or a blue ocean strategy or framework or a value proposition canvas, or for that matter, now that you know about it, a Wordling map. But that's not how it's traditionally done, of course. So this takes a very broad view and it becomes very selective of the future, and then you explore. And you'd be actually surprised how often this is used in strategy formation. So there are a large number of companies that are active on the stock exchanges across the world. that have 4 of these sort of scenarios, or one of these matrices here, as a strong base for the strategy work. So that's one way of doing it. I'll show an example shortly. Another classic method that you can use is the so-called 7 questions method. And this is something that Shell developed. And here you go in and you ask people in the organization that you're doing the analysis for a number of questions. And if you ask something like 10 people in the organization this, you will have a pretty good picture of what they're actually worried about. So what are the trends that you should actually care about the most? The first question is, if you could speak to someone from the future who could tell you anything about whatever it is, tell you something about your company or your organization, what would you like to ask? And that normally gives a pretty clear answer. So I've used this in interviews with clients, and the answers are pretty good. I work with an energy company, for instance, and then when you ask executives, or for that matter, experts inside of that organization, they all talk about the green shift, hydrogen, green shift. And then you can go through, what's your vision for success? So where are you if things have gone all right? What's the dangers if you don't achieve the vision of success, and so on and so forth. But really, the first question is the most important one. And it's actually surprising that what you get out of this, because it becomes pretty clear. So those two are quite common, and they all lead to the same thing. So even with 7 questions, then you do the same sort of double uncertainty after you know roughly what the areas are, and then you explore the result. So from the real world, satellite companies. So this is a client of ours where we've actually done some scenario analysis using the classical approach. And this was actually before we even knew about mapping. So that's we have to be forgiven for that. So if we look at the satellite company, in the space industry where they are working, we use the 7 questions to ask them what are they looking at? What trends are they concerned about? And there's essentially 2 trends. The one thing is all these clusters around the globe. So Simon spoke about how all of a sudden satellites are taking over telecoms. So this cluster idea is essentially that. You have the Starlink from that Elon is putting up there, and you have OneWeb that was I think it used to be a Facebook thing. I think that's actually gone bust. And the other thing is, of course, SpaceX that has reusable rockets. So asking 7 questions, it was pretty clear that these are the 2 sort of main drivers that they're worried about. Yeah. And then we did a pestle and collected a large number of these macro drivers. And could divide them into this importance and uncertainty matrix. And we saw then that we had the rocket reuse, we had COVID-19, satellite clusters, and the world security situations that we thought were important but uncertain. So those goes into the scenario planning. And then we have all of these others that we can just act on accordingly. And then, so when we do the scenario analysis, we take the macro drivers and we find extremes. So if we think about the launch with the reusable rockets, one extreme would be that launch continues to be expensive. So launch in the space industry has been traditionally very expensive because you build a very expensive rocket, you fill it with expensive fuel, you shoot it up into space, and then it's gone. SpaceX has, of course, changed that using reusable rockets. So the other alternative is that launch becomes free. It becomes a loss leader, essentially. So those are the 2 extremes. And then you can do that for all the macro drivers that you've identified as uncertain. And then you choose these sort of stretched macro drivers and you combine them with others. And you get these types of matrices you see over here to the right. So we have a closed system versus an open standards. We have a product business model versus a users business model. And you can check these, the A, B, C, and D here becomes worlds. Yeah. And what do you do with that? You then make descriptions of it. So in this case was a platform and marketplace were the macro drivers, where we create a timeline for whenever this scenario can occur. So 2022 is there's some sort of standard defined, and then we move on, and some sort of base technology becomes open source, and then we have a community of developers using a platform based on this open source technology, and then at some point the marketplace open. And then we create all kinds of narratives around this. So we can have satellite Lego. So all of a sudden, you have all these sort of commoditized satellite pieces available in the store. You can just put together whatever pieces you want for your satellite and shoot it up into space with this very cheap launch. Or you have some sort of supermarket where you can just pick and choose whatever type of satellite you want. And you have possibly some sort of lots and lots of innovative small companies that can MacGyver together all kinds of solutions using these standards that have been developed. So that's sort of the narratives you can talk about, so people can get excited about this. And it's kind of fun, right? And you can use these as input for your strategy. So that's super useful and super fun. So what is the problem? So I think those of you who have been through this this afternoon or this evening probably has a number of things that you think might be wrong with this viewpoint. I don't know. Do we have any suggestions for what might be wrong with doing it this way? Mostly imagination. Yeah, there's a little bit of that actually. It's not mostly imagination because you build it on these real trends that they've identified, that they're quite worried about, right? So it is imagination, but it's not mostly imagination, I wouldn't say. Or there's some sort of gray scale of imagination depending on how far you take this. But the mostly imagination, looking at one snapshot of film, yes, for sure. And yes, I agree, Philip. Anytime you see something that describes more or less the whole world, or the world of an organization described in a 2x2 matrix, I think you should probably be very, very skeptical. So all good comments here. There's all kinds of problems with this, but it is actually useful depending on the organization. So I think it's a bit weird that a very large organization with lots of resources will base its strategy on this type of thinking. It's a bit shallow that way. But we have examples where we and people we know have done exercises like this with smaller companies that have not had any sort of strategic insight before, and then it's always sort of an improvement to where they were. So it's probably better than nothing, but you can do a lot better, of course. So so we motivated this whole action with Shell, right? And it turns out that not even the guy that was responsible for all the successes at Shell, a man called Pierre Vac, not even him, he didn't actually believe in this kind of simplistic development of scenarios. So these are quotes from his article in the HPR, where he actually says that, okay, coming with these relatively shallow scenario descriptions, they don't actually help you to make decisions. And the double uncertainty scenario matrix is just sort of a starting point. You have to actually do a lot more work for this to be effective and to make effective decisions with it. And this article in HBR from 1985 is actually quite interesting, because when they describe the work they did to predict the oil prices, it's quite extensive. So I recommend a read of that. So it didn't actually happen that way at Shell, but it's now sold that way. Another problem with the way that's being done is that a lot of times you will gain very limited amounts of situational awareness. So we have competitors or people that deliver this type of service here in Sweden. And if you Google their name, I won't say it here, but if you Google it, you get articles where their customers are complaining because they are presenting the same scenarios to all organizations, more or less, because it becomes extremely simplistic. Everyone comes up with the same trends. Everyone comes up with the same scenarios. So it turns out you can't be story-driven after all. And I guess Uncle Simon would have said, "Told ya." So how does Wardley mapping change this? So we have very knowledgeable people in the audience when it comes to Wardley mapping, so this probably won't come as a surprise. But if you're a bit more new to Wardley mapping, it will blow your mind, hopefully. So all of a sudden, when you use Wardley mapping, it actually ties whatever is going on to our actual current reality. So it becomes much less of imagination. It becomes much more real, which is a big, big, big improvement. So, for instance, if we look at these major trends for the satellite company I was talking about, had we used the Wardley map instead of these fancy techniques that we used before, it's pretty clear it's just moves in maturity. So you could argue, for instance, that what's happening with satellites is that they're being standardized and coming into product stage, perhaps even into the commodity stage. You could argue that the launch, given that you have reusable rockets, are now becoming a commodity, right? So this picture, compared to the picture I showed you with the scenarios before, it's pretty simple. So, and it's much simpler, it says the same thing, and it could be anticipated before it even happened. It's not you don't have to see it in hindsight, which is the whole idea. Oops. So given that these trends now can be tied to the value chain and can be tied to the customer needs, all of a sudden it becomes much easier to understand. All of a sudden it becomes a much basis for decisions, it becomes a much basis for experiments, and it becomes a much better base for strategy in general. What the other thing that maps gives us is the things around the wheel, right? So we have, all of a sudden, we have climate. And we have all these recognizable patterns. So we can figure out, okay, we can now predict these movements. So if we want to use our imagination, we can use our imagination for what will happen here. We don't have to use our imagination for what's going to happen with standardized satellites so much. We don't have to use our imagination for launch. We can take that as more or less a given, so I'll get into that, and start to think about what will happen here. Or for that matter, where do we play in this value chain right here? Our satellite company, they are here in the satellite and in the carrier. They're not so much in the launch. So what are they going to do? So the carrier has not been affected so much yet. Can they do something? So that means that some trends that felt uncertain before, all of a sudden, they're very certain all of a sudden. So then we can start to think about other questions. So we know that these are trends and we know that they're going to happen. Why are they or why aren't they happening? So we can think about inertia in the whole value chain, right? So we can think about the satellites, assuming we had this map a bit earlier. We can think about it. What's stopping satellites from being productized? What is stopping the carriers from being a commodity? What's stopping launch from being a commodity? Can we do something about it? It's a normal strategic thinking. It's a normal challenging of the map that we would talk about when we use worldly maps, of course. And that means we can also use the maps to find things to watch out for. So if we look here, we can start to think about, okay, what's going to take this into commodity? There has to be some innovation in the rocket, most likely. So we have to look out for that. And we can predict what's going to happen when someone develops a reusable rocket. So if we had this map in 2003, which probably would have been impossible because that's before the birth of maps, I guess. I think that was in 2005. What would we do? So would we try to do reusable rockets? Probably not, because it took sort of a genius of Elon Musk's size to make that happen. But we could look out for it, and we could prepare for it. We could think about the satellites. Will satellites actually go standardized before this happens? And we can create a whole strategy around it. And it becomes much more tangible than a scenario analysis would be. And of course, if we go back a step, if we want to be exploratory and still use the techniques, sort of these established techniques, we can still use worldly maps to map out the future scenarios. So we can describe the world using worldly maps. The scenarios that we get can be described using worldly maps. And so, and that will give us a much richer picture than any sort of story-based method would probably ever be able to give us. So that's great. Or we can just leave it be and decide that trying to predict the future in this manner using scenarios is maybe not what we should be doing. Maybe that's not where we want our strategy to go. That's not what we want to build our strategy on. So maybe it's a sign that we should go towards more situational awareness, OODA proficiency, true business agility, etc., using what Simon is calling doctrine, and etc. Because that is actually what Shell did. So they didn't do all these matrices. Well, they did, but that's not really what helped them. They did very, very detailed situational awareness around what was going on with oil reserves and how the different actors in the market would what they would do depending on their production numbers and so on and so forth. And that way, they were able to move very, very fast when they saw the signs that they predicted. So a very, very strong example of what situational awareness can actually bring you. So it turns out we're actually back here where we want to be with Sun Tzu's different factors for competition, with Simon's wheel or Simon's loop, or with John Boyd's OODA loop. That's where it's at, and that's probably where we want to go. So in summary, what we can say is that there's a long, rich history of scenario analysis. But it has a number of problems. So you risk making too much of too little. Simon talks a lot about SWOT, and I will probably place this in sort of the SWOT box. And it turns out that many of sort of the success stories that are being touted for scenario analysis actually are not so much in the scenarios themselves. It's from the activity of constantly being aware of your surroundings. So essentially, it's about building situational awareness. That's what's actually bringing the results. And in a way, then, given what we know now, it's likely, and this is a personal opinion of mine, that continuous mapping or continuous wordly mapping is probably the best alternative for this that you can have as an organization. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. You can reach me on Twitter. I'm Johan Frilsbo there, or you can email me at johanpersson@rubars.se. And you're, of course, also welcome to add me on LinkedIn, or if you can find me on other social medias. Any questions or comments from the audience? So Philip, you say, I have done this in a company as an actor, and people went on high-level scenarios that either we could do nothing about. We also missed the scenarios that were real and we could do something about. Yeah, that's a big that's a big risk, of course. Philip, did you use the sort of methods, similar methods to what I described here, or did you use something else? If you're still in the room, it'd be interesting to know. Let's see. Thank you, Christian. We have
a question.
Joaquin. Hi.
Okay, so you say before, well, this is the old method that I use. Apologies for that. I think we all are learning and we have progressing. So what we see in the past is not a mistake; it's a learning process. So you have been doing the job. You have been doing the job in the past with other tools, and probably in some cases, because not the same tool fits at all in all places. But when you have the opportunity to use Varley mapping, what is the difference that you find out, or with respect with the situations where you have been using the other old methods?
So I haven't done this. I haven't done a lot of this in client engagements. I think I've done 2 or 3 or something like that. But so one of them, for instance, was for the satellite company, which is the example. We did scenario analysis to revamp their sort of portfolio of ideas for new products. And we got quite a bit of ideas for it. But it was very difficult to have any idea whether those ideas had any legs.
Okay.
And then I've done very similar things. So looking at product areas in other companies, and they're using worded maps. And there it's very easy to get ideas. And it's very easy to understand that if the ideas work, technically, they have legs. So, for instance, you can take an example from a communications company where they use crypto, where there's parts of crypto that is being commoditized, or there are commoditized versions of crypto. And it's pretty obvious if you know wordly mapping that, okay, we should probably try to build the product on this commoditized version of the crypto, not build it ourselves, even though that's probably efficient and so on. So that's the type of difference you get. The things you come up with has legs because you have all these support structures really for the scenarios that you develop using wordly maps. where you have a lot of certainty about what's going to happen, or at least you have very much, you can pinpoint where you have to investigate to figure out what the future is. So I think it's a big difference.
Okay, so if I understood that,
Yeah.
when you have used that and people accepted and adopted that, that is another question that it doesn't always happen. What I see is that in reality you have sold them a tool or a way to have glasses that enable them to quickly identify what not to do and what to do, because at the end of the day, and in the example that you say, crypto element that it's commoditized, you don't build by yourself, you consume from other place, and you focus your energy and effort on that, so that they quickly adopt that, right?
Yeah, or I mean, again, adapt. That's always a difficult thing, right? But yes, you're completely correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? See if there's anything in the chat. Or Philippe, did you want to ask something?
You called me out for the comment I made earlier.
Yeah.
And yes, that was using the pesto approach.
Yeah.
But what's happening with it, it was so macro that, yes, there's a financial crisis. Okay, well, we're going to have to adapt. But I appreciate, some elements of, well, you want to see those extreme scenarios to actually figure how resilient you are to them.
Yeah.
But they were way too macro, and there was no way of calibrating it. And, when you get quite a few execs in the same room, it's expensive.
Yeah.
It's very expensive. So if you don't have something actable as a result of it, it's and it may have had to do with whoever was facilitating it as well, because some people are probably would have been better and really getting the rooms to focus on the right thing, but it wasn't evident as part of the process, whereas a map would be a lot more evident.
Yeah, I think so. So there are two things I think using this methods where you get lost. So it's prioritizing all of these sort of extreme points, or first prioritizing the macro factors. That's usually not that difficult, but then prioritizing these extreme points is difficult. And to do that prioritization, you need to look at the dependence of them somehow. And that's quite difficult to do in a workshop setting. It's probably some sort of desk job exercise. And usually there's no time for that. And even then, it's likely that you get it wrong. And then, of course, it becomes very combinatorial, right? So here I've shown three times three, right? No, sorry, three. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 macro drivers here. No, it's 4. Sorry, 4 macro drivers here that we stretch, and that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 4, 24 different futures. All right, and then you choose futures to explore for these scenarios that you're going to use for your strategy. How do you choose the right ones? How do you know that these are the most interesting ones? It's impossible. It's just going to be opinions. So it's very easy to get the results that you're talking about, Philip. So I recognize it a lot.
And when you said, it's easy to do the first part, if you calibrate the first part at the wrong level, the rest is going to be sort of an entertainment session for executives, really.
Yeah.
It's not going to really drive the precise things where you can act on them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Completely.
The point is that sometimes in some organizations they want to stay there because in reality they don't want to move and expose themselves to the exposure that they have taken a risk, that they will be penalized personally.
Yeah.
I find that we sometimes say negative things about this, but in reality, when it's used and the purpose is completely different, these type of tools, they are very useful. They protect the employee, the executive employee, in so many times.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in a political situation and you're asked to do something about the future and you don't want to do something about the future, having this type of exercise is, of course, fantastic, because you really don't have to do anything about it if you don't want to. You can just say that you've done it, of course. But that's, I mean, if you deliver these services, it's a bit... I mean, you can't work in an environment for that with that kind of sentience. That's a bit much.
Sandesh was making a very valid point, which I come across all the time, and sometimes I'm asked. I mean, in an engagement at the moment, I'm actually, what's the state of the product or the state of the present? Because everybody has assumptions. But actually, once you start realizing what's the state of the present, and of course, there's going to be directions, but almost like vectors, not destination, vectors from the state of the present, that gives you, and of course, and you can look at scenarios, and one may upset the journeys, but actually, the state of the present is often just broken assumptions all over the place. And in Dave Snowden's view, it's really about exploring the potential of the present with directions, not actually building an idealistic future. And those things tend to actually give you the 2x2s and so on, tend to future plan and do all those things, like paint a picture of the future, but it's unrealizable. Whereas starting from a map, you'll have the present, you have the movement, and you can look at how you're going to realize it. So it provides much better insight.
Yeah. I think if I was to design a process to do scenario analysis where you had to, so Sandesh, he asks, what are some good practices to involve more players rather than just the senior management, as it usually happens in this entire exercise? So if you think about the sort of classical exercise, if we're not using Wordly maps, a good way is to make sure that you ask as many as possible using some sort of digital tool. You can either do it yourself in like SurveyMonkey or something like that, to ask them about what macro trends are you worried about, or do you think is going to change our reality or our future? So that's one thing. You can also send out the 7 questions in the same way and then sort of put it together. And then you can involve them. There are online tools to do this with more people as well, but you still run into the same sort of things. If I were going to do this using Wordly maps, I would probably do some sort of 7 questions survey that I would send out to an organization. And then I would find sort of the areas that the 7 questions identify, and then I would map those areas. And then maybe you can do the mapping in several groups of the same sort of general area and see what you come up with if they agree. Alternatively, you make a map of it and you send it back to the people that contributed to the 7 questions. So it's always a level of contribution from people and how big you want to do it. Assuming you're doing it as a consultant as well, it's also a question of how many people gets involved from the company, because their involvement is a cost of the project you're doing. So there's that. I hope that's an answer, Sandesh.
One approach I'd like to take is to basically ask, and especially when you have value streams.
Yeah.
But if you don't, just identify what are the valuable things for the company and who's involved. And they need to do a map there against the value, because you recognize your users, you recognize the value, and then you look at how you're serving that. And then basically at the more senior level, it's about creating coherence of it. So looking at a broader spectrum of value, and they become point of coherence. So the points of strategy become lower down, but if you want agency and autonomy, it has to be. It cannot be, deciding from the top, everybody is executing at that point. If you want agency, autonomy, and agility, you need to move the strategy closer to where the work is happening and the value is realized. And if you create it like that, then because the senior layers above become points of coherence, really.
Yeah.
And you organize the coherence in the organization. And then strategy has to become continuous as well. So it's iterative continuously, where at the different levels, it all talks to each other from a cascade and emergence perspective.
Yeah, it becomes the OODA proficient organization, essentially. So Sandesh also asks, how do you prevent these from devolving into X-rated analogies heard before elsewhere? Willy wanking, mental masturbation. Yeah, so to me at least, that's where mapping comes in, because you could, depending on who you ask, maybe mapping is a little bit of mental masturbation as well. But it's comparatively straightforward. And if you really challenge and you go through the doctrine and knowing the details, knowing the customer needs and so on, it becomes actually quite real when you do maps, regardless of level you do it. That's at least my experience. So I think introducing maps in this area, whether it's replacing all of the stuff that I've shown with just mapping in groups at different levels, whether it's sending out the 7 questions and mapping the areas that you find, or just using maps in the quadrants that you found, it will always improve the result and reduce the risk of mental masturbation. That's I don't have data on that, but it's my experience and the feeling I have. All right. Are there other questions? Thank you so much for all your questions and for the comments. It's very nice to that someone cares enough about what you talk about to comment. It's great. Again, would we take cognitive load into picture? Cognitive load of whom? I don't exactly understand what you mean with cognitive load. So that was a question from Anit. So I don't know if you can clarify. People and their understanding about the context. So it always. So let me see if I understand what you mean. And this is a bit above my intelligence level, but anytime, yeah.
Johan, cognitive load, it's, I don't know if I understand that you understand the concept. And for instance, in the IT industry, the use of cognitive load, it's very well used. You can imagine a software developer that it's working sometimes in trying to solve a problem on a code that doesn't work. So he required or she requires to be very concentrated and understanding really well the problem, and that it means a lot of cognitive load. Or then one that is solved, the person has to write down everything and document that. It's a process that in reality everything is in your mind and you only have to write down. So when you work in teams, and you work with people of these teams, you try to take the workload of this cognitive load, share. And there are some maps, and I have seen some maps that work with that, because in terms of mapping, you can paint components, but you also can paint knowledge. And this is where I think that Anit could be talking about.
So if I try to understand it, so in a way, when you collect this data, I don't think the cognitive load on anyone participating with the data, giving you macro drivers or answering the 7 questions, the cognitive load there is not extremely high. So you can probably trust that the data is not going to change if people concentrate more on it. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I guess the cognitive load then in the rest of the people participating in the rest of the process will probably have an impact. But yeah, I don't know exactly what it will be.
In my experience, it's a bit of a load for people to understand mapping if they try to map themselves. But actually, if you organize a conversation and you map what's being discussed as it happens, and then you walk through it, you do small checkpoints during the session where, did I get that right? And I represent it like that. They kind of mapping by stealth, and they understand it because it's in the context of what they're doing. So rather than teaching them all about mapping and so on, they talk about their business, you map it, and you explain the map to confirm that you're getting things right. And it reduces the load for people considerably, and they actually get mapping, and they get to make decisions from map. They may not be able to, on a blank map, to go and map themselves at the start, but it will come. And you just support them through that journey, and you reduce the load of the tool so they can concentrate on the load of the content that they're discussing. And the map is the conduit in that.
I completely agree. So normally, so if that then that's a better take on the cognitive load. So normally, I think it's good to decrease the cognitive load as much as possible. And when you do this, when I say we could do mapping, it means that someone should facilitate the mapping. I think it's entirely possible to teach a large number of people to map. But again, cognitive load of doing that is probably very high. So whereas essentially I've done mapping sessions where I just sit and ask knowledgeable people questions and they just answer questions and they don't have to care about the map at all. The map sort of appears and then we can control it and they say that they agree with each point in it or they don't, and then we change it over. And then that's very low cognitive load. They just answer questions. Maybe that becomes a better answer, Anit, I hope. Let's see if there's anything else. Let's see, Michael Heiss, customer need. Okay, yeah. So I think that's that.